Welcome back, everybody, to the cigar smoke-filled back room. I am Doug with Tusk Consulting. TuskConsulting@gmail.com. TuskConsulting@gmail.com. If you are a pro-gun Republican and you need political consulting help, drop me a line at that email address and we can work something out. If you are not a pro-gun Republican, you're on the wrong channel. So, in today's ongoing video series about things in politics that are not discussed enough or not discussed honestly enough, we're going to talk about contested primaries. And before we get too far in here, we are sporting the Monte Cristo cigar today, and a rather big one at that. Again, not sponsors to the program or anything, but I'd like them to be. Anyhow, we are in primary season right now. Super Tuesday is next week, I think. Michigan just had their primary yesterday. It is a time for choosing, but a choosing of nominee, not of office holder. And that's the difference between a primary election and a general election. In a primary election, it is the members of a party, more or less, that choose who their nominees will be for specific offices, for president, for U.S. Senate, for governor, congressman, county commissioner, township trustee, whatever, what have you. And so it is not the entirety of the electorate. It is only members of the political party. Typically the major political parties are the ones that will do this. Others tend to run as independents or nonpartisans. But the degree of openness of the primary does matter. There are what are called open primaries. There are closed primaries. Then there's kind of shades of degrees in between. So an open primary is where anybody can walk in, any voter that is, and say, hey, I want to pull a Republican ballot, or I want to pull a Democrat ballot, or I want to pull a Green Party ballot, whatever. And the election officials are obliged to give them that ballot regardless of whether that voter is registered as that particular party affiliation or not. In some states, in fact, like my home state of Ohio, the way currently under the law to become affiliated with a political party is exactly to do that, to vote in a primary, in a partisan political primary in one of the major parties' primaries. If you do that, then if you pull a Republican ballot in a primary, now you're a Republican. If next year you pull a Democrat ballot in a primary, now you're a Democrat. So there are open primaries, and then there are closed primaries. Closed primaries, very different. They typically require that you be already affiliated with the political party whose ballot you are voting in prior to election day, or typically prior to some number of days prior to 30 days out, 60 days out, 90 days out, whatever. These are the kind of, where this happens is typically states where you can affiliate with a major political party by declaration, right? When you register to vote, you say, I am a Republican, or whatever. Then you fill it out, and you say, yeah, I'm a Republican, and it's a declarative process. Not all states are like that. And then there are states that have kind of shades of gray in between. Some require that if you pull their party's ballot, that you sign a loyalty pledge and so forth. And so, there's the ends of the spectrum, totally open, totally closed, and then there's kind of, the in-between phases. But anyhow, and of course, depending on those rules will also depend on who's eligible to show up. But regardless, typically, primary elections have lower turnout than general elections. And you have voters who are very regular voters in general elections that sometimes just don't ever bother to show up in a primary, right? They only think about it in November. They don't think about it in March or May or whenever the primary in their state is. They think about voting in November. And they may be very, very high propensity general election voters, but very low propensity primary voters. And so, depending again on how your state does political affiliation, sometimes it can be hard to categorize who these voters are. Are they Republican? Are they Democrat? Are they truly swing voters? Just because somebody doesn't have partisan affiliation doesn't mean they're in the middle of the road. They can be extremely conservative or extremely liberal, but just never voted in a primary, and you wouldn't be able to tell. Regardless, back to the turnout model. Being that it's a primary election and not everybody's eligible to vote anyway, oftentimes the turnout is lower. Additionally, a lot of times the really interesting races are already resolved before it gets to your state. I think about the way the presidential race works. You get the Iowa caucus, then you got the New Hampshire primary, then South Carolina, Nevada, and Nevada, then South Carolina, then Michigan, and then comes Super Tuesday. Well, geez, by the time we get to my state of Ohio on March 19th, man, it's usually over, right? Now, in 2016, it wasn't. In 2016, there was still some contesting going on, and so we had a pretty high turnout in 2016 on our side of the aisle. But, and that's the other thing. Sometimes if you have one side of the aisle has an interesting primary and the other side of the aisle does not, you'll have people that cross over, especially in those open primary states. They'll say, well, I'm a Democrat and I want to vote in the Democrat primary, but boy, the Republicans really have the interesting primary and our primary is all locked up, so I'm going to go over there and vote, right? And those things happen. They absolutely do. Probably not to a degree sufficient to actually change any outcomes, but they do cause a little havoc, a little bit of chaos. Rush Limbaugh famously back in the day called for Operation Chaos for precisely this reason. Play around with the other party, stick your toe in their backyard and, stick your tongue out and wave your fingers at them and, just irritate the other side a little bit. These things do happen, but again, they probably don't change outcomes all that much. So, since we're talking about presidential politics here for a minute, the primaries don't actually choose the nominee. They choose delegates to the convention that choose nominee. Now, there are also state-level conventions that can occur depending on what state you're in and depending on what the bylaws of the state-level parties are. But generally speaking, primaries determine candidates who the nominee is, with the exception of president and president, vice president. It is you're choosing delegates to the convention that on the first ballot are pledged to whoever they were affiliated with on the ballot. But after that, they can typically vote for whoever they wish. Now, having said that, there hasn't been a truly open convention in American presidential politics in like 50 odd years. Is it possible there could be one in the near future? I mean, I would say it doesn't seem likely, but this is also politics, and in politics a day is an eternity, and there's a lot of eternities between now and the conventions. So yeah, it could happen, but I'm not betting on it either. These days, the national conventions are largely media pageants, right? They're an opportunity for the political party to showcase what they're all about, put their best foot forward, get really invigorating speakers up, put on a good show so that people at home can see, wow, they look really optimistic, and wow, hey, they've got some good ideas. Wow, did you hear that guy speak? Wow, he's really good. It's about putting on a good show and being appealing to the general electorate in a presidential election year. So, but back to primaries, because it's not just it's not just presidential politics we're talking about. It's primaries at any level. It could be primary for county commissioner, Congress, or state rep, whatever. So first thing is, people declare before the filing deadline that they're going to run for office. And a lot of people declare that don't end up actually filing. And so part of that is, and there's a whole bunch of theories as to when you should declare and how you should declare and what your declaration press release should look like, and et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to dive into all that. That's well beyond the scope of this. But sometimes people put things out there as a feeler. Sometimes they put things out there early to try to convince other people to get out of the way. But then filing day comes and everybody files their petitions and so forth. And some candidates are waiting for that to see who actually files, right? It could be you have a multi-way primary and one of those candidates is significantly stronger than the other ones. Maybe they've got more name ID. Maybe they've got more campaign finance money already in the bank, cash on hand. That would make the contest very one-sided. And so when you get to filing day, that's really when the rubber meets the road, right? some candidates talk about wanting to run and then don't file. Some candidates talk about running, file, and then shortly after they drop out. And then, of course, once you actually get into campaigning, you actually have the field set now, the number of people that are going to run. You'll start doing fundraising, and as we talked about in the hard money video, the first campaign finance report can be very revealing as to who the good candidates are and who the bad candidates are. Because if you're not raising money, you're not a good candidate. No, you don't have to raise the most, but you got to raise enough to be competitive. So, in addition to starting to raise money in that first campaign finance report that's so critical, getting endorsements then becomes important. Of course, we did a video on endorsements. But a thought when it comes to the primaries. Getting endorsements, especially when it comes to single issue organizations, requires a bit of pandering to the base. Now, that's not all bad, but it involves purity tests. And purity tests can be net negatives in a general election depending on where you're running, depending on the electorate, and frankly, depending on how sincere you as the candidate are being, and what kind of ammunition your opponent, what kind of cash campaign financing your opponent in the general election is going to have to make an issue out of your pandering to the base. So, again, pandering to the base isn't all bad. If you believe in the things you're saying, and you are a motivating individual, somebody that can rally the troops, well, then, telling the base the things that you firmly believe are just fine, and you may actually increase voter turnout with your leadership on an issue. That's A-okay. But if you're pandering to the base, just because you're saying just what you think they need to hear, and you don't actually believe it, and you're not very inspiring, that's really not helpful at all. Additionally, this is also the time where your candidates start making public appearances. They go around town. They go to various events. They start knocking on doors, etc. And this is where we get to another factor when it comes to campaigning. Some factors in electoral politics are easily quantified and some are not. The easily quantifiable includes things like money. It's a number, how much cash on hand you have, right? I can find that number, and I can rate the candidates by how much cash on hand they have. Things like prior ballot name ID. I can say candidate A has been on the ballot twice before, candidate B has been on the ballot 4 times, candidate C has never been on the ballot, and I can quantify that. Some things are not easy to quantify. Leadership traits, charisma, these things are tough to quantify. And they don't just cut one way. Love him or hate him, Barack Obama had a certain amount of charisma about him. Love him or hate him, Al Gore had no charisma at all. He was a completely wooden chunk of unlikability. And quite frankly, if it weren't for his name, that he was the son of Al Gore Sr., Al Gore Jr. probably never would have been anything in politics. But money and dad's name ID can overcome an awful lot of unlikability. But regardless, when candidates start making these personal appearances, doing the media circuit, going to these groups, knocking on the doors, that's where some likability comes into play. Hey, sometimes you'll get candidates that you say, I don't agree with everything that guy's saying. But dang it, I wouldn't want to argue with him because he seems like he's really got his stuff together. And those are really cool candidates, right? When you get people that have enough personal magnetism that they can overcome some minor differences. Because look, you don't need to agree with the candidate 100%. Remember, if a candidate's telling you 100% of what you believe, I'm here to tell you the odds are they don't believe it all. They're lying to you. They're pandering to you. That's not what you're looking for. You're looking for somebody with whom you agree mostly, and on the stuff that you disagree with, hopefully, A, it's not major, and B, they have enough other personality traits to overcome those relatively minor differences. Then we also have, as part of the campaigning process in the primary, the media buys. This is why we raise the money, so we can spend it on media. Direct mail pieces, radio ads, streaming ads, yard signs, etc., etc., etc. You've heard it all from me before. Here's the thing, though. Remember, primaries are lower turnout models than general elections, right? They're lower interest, just the way things are. You can like it or not, that's how it is. Here's a trick. The further out from an election you are, also the lower interest, the fewer people paying attention. You can spend an absurd amount of money 6-9 months out from a primary and not move the needle hardly at all, and I've seen people do it. I've seen very good candidates with an awful lot of money blow just crazy chunks of it. And they did a poll before they did their big media buy, and then after their media buy, they'd run another poll, and they'd move like 2%. And they go, whoa, how is this not effective? Because no one's paying attention. Right? I mean, there's only so much you can do when people aren't paying attention. People aren't engaged yet. You have to be, the whole make hay while the sun shines, right? If the sun ain't shining, you ain't making hay. That's just how it is. If the sun is shining, that's when you get your butt out there and you make an awful lot of hay. So the point here is media buys, you do them when the electorate is paying attention. It's more critical in primaries because the overall interest and turnout is lower, and therefore you have to be as efficient as possible because you just don't have the level of interest that you do in a general election. And of course, all of this comes down to the fact that a primary is not a championship, it's more like a semifinal. And so for your candidates, this is a win or go home kind of moment, right? They have to win the primary to get a chance at the general election. And just because they win the primary doesn't mean they're the office holder. It means they get the opportunity to go fight another battle. And this is one of the times where some insiders tend to not like primaries, contested primaries. And let me explain what I mean by that. Some insiders believe that a coronation, if you will, or maybe you let the people file and you let them all, all right, they've all filed, you get their first campaign finance report comes out and one candidate clearly is up here and the other candidates are all down here. And some party insiders will say, you know what, this is where we need to clear the field. This candidate is the one that's viable. These candidates are jokers. They're not doing anything productive. All they're going to do is force this candidate up here to spend a whole lot of money that otherwise could be used in the general election against our Democrat opponent, right? That is one side of the coin. Because again, money is limited, resources are finite, and if they have to spend the money in the primary, then they don't have it in the general. The flip side of that argument is that the primary election is a process where we can vet our candidates. So it's also a competition where we can see, iron sharpens iron. Who does better? You make yourself run a race, you get faster, right? A training race before the marathon kind of thing. And it does make candidates better. And candidates that are forced to run contested primaries do tend to do better. It's often not the end of the world, although it does tend to limit their financial flexibility in the general. But they also do get some residual name ID hits from that contested primary. So it's not all bad. Some people tend to believe that it is. And again, there's arguments that can be made on both sides of that. Having said all that, back to the lower turnout model. Because it's lower turnout, typically the people that decide primaries in hotly contested primary elections are the ideologically motivated parts of each party's base. And what does that mean? It means for Republicans, more conservative electorate shows up in the primary than shows up in the general. For Democrats, more liberal electorate shows up in the primary than shows up in the general. The result of which is, in contested races, you end up getting, all things equal, people that are more polarized, candidates, nominees that are more polarized than they are centrist. And you can look at that as good or bad as you wish, but the fact of the matter is it's true. And as a result of that, you can end up nominating a candidate that is on the fringe of, again, either party, that is great for the base, that the base loves, but may not be terribly attractive to moderate voters. In the general election, you may need to get some of those moderate voters in order to win. And remember, this is very much a win or go home thing. You got to win that primary to even have a shot at the general. But you don't want to win the primary in a Pyrrhic victory where you can't win the general. And again, remember I said we got to vet our candidates? Well, if you have a multi-way contested primary and the candidate that comes out of it as the nominee didn't get properly vetted, then that primary was a waste. If there's oppo floating around out there that the other side can use in the general election and it didn't come out in the primary, now you're hosed because you're stuck with the nominee. Give a quick example of that here in Ohio. Ed Fitzgerald ran for governor. And I don't recall if he had a serious primary opponent or not. Democrats tend to have fewer primaries, hotly contested primaries, than we Republicans do. Partially because, there's a host of reasons why it doesn't matter. They tend to have fewer. And I don't think Ed Fitzgerald had a very strong primary opponent, so he didn't really get vetted all that well. The opposition research team dug up some details about his personal life that were juicy, very juicy, and they did the responsible thing. They sat on it. They sat on it till about Labor Day, and then they started dribbling it out every week, until by the time we got to the general election in November, I think you get 30-odd% of the vote or something, which Ohio's a center-right state, but he should have done a heck of a lot better than that, even if he wasn't going to win. He didn't, because he didn't get vetted in the primary. Had that come out in the primary and another candidate been able to surpass him and say, hey, I don't have this personal baggage that this guy has, I'm the better choice, then that vetting process would have functioned and they could have produced a better nominee for governor. They didn't, and as a result, they got absolutely devastated in that election, and in my opinion, rightfully so. But anyway, that's an example of the vetting process not working the way it's supposed to. Anyhow, with that, thank you everyone for your attention. Again, I am Doug with Tusk Consulting. TuskConsulting@gmail.com is the email address. And I gave platelets again today at the Red Cross. So go to the Red Cross, give blood, give platelets. They really do need it. And I'll see you in the next one.